On the night of January 30th, 1945, in the freezing waters of the Baltic Sea, a single torpedo strike sank a ship carrying an almost imaginable number of people, the overwhelming majority of them civilians, refugees, wounded soldiers, and children fleeing the advancing Soviet army. The death toll from that single sinking exceeded the combined losses of the Titanic and the Lusitania several times over, making it, by a significant margin, the deadliest maritime disaster in recorded history.
Most people have never heard of it.
The ship was called the Wilhelm Gustloff, and the disaster that claimed an estimated 9,000 lives in a single night has remained, for the 8 decades since it occurred, one of the most consequential yet genuinely obscure catastrophes of the entire Second World War. A tragedy caught in the uncomfortable historical space between a German vessel sunk during a war of German aggression and a genuine human catastrophe involving overwhelmingly civilian casualty. A combination that left the disaster largely unaddressed and unacknowledged for decades following the war's end.
This is the true story of the Wilhelm Gustloff, the deadliest shipwreck in human history, and the reasons why so few people today have ever heard its name. To understand how a single ship came to carry such an extraordinary number of people, it helps to understand the desperate, chaotic military and civilian situation unfolding across East Prussia and the broader eastern regions of Germany during the final months of the war. By January 1945, Soviet forces had launched a massive, rapid offensive across the Eastern Front, pushing deep into German territory with a speed and ferocity that caught many German civilian authorities and the broader civilian population genuinely unprepared for the scale and pace of the advance. The advancing Soviet army's reputation for brutal treatment of German civilians in occupied territory, a reputation grounded in genuine, extensively documented atrocities that Soviet forces committed against German civilians during this phase of the war, had spread rapidly among the German population of the Eastern territories, generating a genuine, widespread panic and desperate desire to flee westward ahead of the advancing front, regardless of the enormous practical difficulty and danger such an evacuation, undertaken in the depths of a brutal Baltic winter, would inevitably involve. German military and civilian authorities, recognizing the scale of the unfolding humanitarian crisis and the genuine strategic value of evacuating as many civilians, wounded soldiers, and military personnel as possible before Soviet forces could complete their encirclement of the region, organized a massive, hastily improvised evacuation effort, later known as Operation Hannibal, which would ultimately become one of the largest single-sea evacuation operations in human history, moving well over 1 million people across the Baltic Sea to relative safety in the war's final months, employing virtually every available vessel that German naval authorities could press into service for this purpose. The Wilhelm Gustloff, originally constructed in the 1930s as a large civilian cruise ship specifically built to provide affordable recreational cruises to German workers under a Nazi-organized leisure program, had spent much of the war serving various military support functions rather than its original civilian recreational purpose, including service as a floating barracks for German naval personnel stationed in the port city of Gdynia, occupied Polish territory that German forces had renamed Gotenhofen following their earlier conquest of Poland. By January 1945, as the scale of the evacuation crisis became clear, the Wilhelm Gustloff was pressed into service as an evacuation vessel, intended to carry as many refugees, wounded soldiers, and military personnel as possible away from the rapidly approaching Soviet advance. The ship's official passenger capacity, based on its original design specifications as a civilian cruise vessel, was intended for a maximum of approximately 1,800 passengers under normal peacetime operating conditions. The desperate scale of the evacuation crisis unfolding in January 1945, however, resulted in the vessel being loaded with a number of passengers that dramatically exceeded this original design capacity by a truly staggering margin,
with historians' subsequent estimates suggesting the ship may have been carrying somewhere between 10 and 11,000 people at the time of its departure, a figure that remains subject to some degree of ongoing historical uncertainty, given the genuinely chaotic conditions under which passengers were loaded aboard, with complete, reliable passenger manifests never having been fully compiled, given the overwhelming, desperate circumstances of the evacuation itself.
This passenger population aboard the Wilhelm Gustloff reflected the genuinely chaotic, desperate nature of the broader evacuation crisis, including several thousand civilian refugees, predominantly women, children, and elderly individuals fleeing the advancing Soviet front, alongside several thousand wounded German soldiers being evacuated from military hospitals in the region, naval personnel and military support staff, and a contingent of naval cadets and instructors who had been using the vessel for training purposes in the period before its evacuation role began.
The sheer scale of overcrowding aboard the vessel meant that many passengers, having secured passage through whatever combination of official processing, personal connections, or sheer desperate persistence the chaotic boarding process allowed, found themselves crowded into virtually every available space aboard the ship, including areas never designed or intended to accommodate passengers under any normal circumstances. The Wilhelm Gustloff departed from Gotenhofen on the afternoon of January 30, 1945, as part of a small convoy of vessels undertaking the dangerous winter crossing of the Baltic Sea toward relative safety further west, escorted by a limited naval escort that proved genuinely insufficient given the scale of the passenger population aboard the ship and the very real danger of Soviet submarine activity that continued to operate within the Baltic Sea, despite the broader German military collapse occurring across the Eastern Front during this same period. The ship's captain and the broader command structure aboard the vessel faced a series of difficult, consequential decisions in the hours following departure regarding the specific route and operational precautions the ship should take to minimize the risk of enemy attack during its crossing. A particularly consequential decision involved whether to activate the ship's navigation lights, a measure that would improve visibility and reduce the risk of collision with other vessels operating in the crowded, hazardous winter waters, but that would simultaneously make the ship considerably more visible to any Soviet submarines that might be operating in the vicinity, a genuine tactical trade-off that ship's command ultimately resolved by activating the lights, a decision that some historians have subsequently suggested may have contributed to the Soviet submarine that would ultimately attack the vessel being able to identify and target it more easily in the darkness. The Soviet submarine S-13, commanded by Alexander Marinsko, had been operating in the region specifically searching for German vessels to attack as part of the broader Soviet naval campaign against German shipping in the Baltic Sea during this final phase of the war.
Marinesko, whose own personal and professional history included previous disciplinary issues within the Soviet naval command structure that had placed his career under some degree of scrutiny in the period leading up to this patrol, spotted the Wilhelm Gustloff during the evening of January 30th and began maneuvering the submarine into a position to attack the vessel, apparently unaware of, or in any case not deterred by, the possibility that the ship might be carrying a substantial civilian passenger population rather than functioning purely as a military transport vessel. At approximately 9 o'clock in the evening, Marinesko ordered the submarine to fire a spread of torpedoes at the Wilhelm Gustloff, with 3 of the 4 torpedoes fired successfully striking the vessel, inflicting catastrophic structural damage that would result in the ship sinking within a remarkably short period of time, a genuinely devastating outcome given the enormous number of passengers aboard and the extraordinarily challenging conditions, including freezing winter temperatures and rough, dark seas, that would confront anyone attempting to escape the sinking vessel and survive in the water or aboard whatever limited lifeboats and rescue vessels might be able to reach the scene. The ship's sinking proceeded with devastating speed, providing many of the passengers aboard with only a brief window of time to attempt any kind of organized evacuation before the vessel went down entirely. A situation made considerably more chaotic and deadly by the sheer overcrowding aboard the ship, which meant that many passengers faced enormous difficulty simply navigating through crowded corridors and stairwells to reach the ship's deck and whatever lifeboats or emergency evacuation equipment remained available.
equipment that had, in any case, never been designed to accommodate anything close to the actual number of passengers the ship was carrying at the time of the attack.
The specific horror of the Wilhelm Gustloff sinking was compounded significantly by the brutal winter conditions in which it occurred, with air and water temperatures cold enough that even passengers who successfully escaped the sinking vessel itself and made it into the water or aboard whatever limited lifeboats were available faced an extremely high likelihood of death from hypothermia within a relatively short period of time, given the genuinely limited capacity of the surrounding rescue vessels to reach and recover survivors from the frigid Baltic waters before cold exposure proved fatal.
Several nearby vessels, alerted to the sinking, made considerable efforts to rescue as many survivors as possible from the freezing waters in the hours following the attack. And these rescue efforts did succeed in saving a meaningful number of lives, though the sheer scale of the original passenger population aboard the Wilhelm Gustloff meant that even a genuinely determined, effective rescue operation could realistically save only a fraction of those who had been aboard the vessel at the time of the attack, given both the extreme cold and the sheer logistical challenge of locating and recovering survivors scattered across a wide area of dark, rough winter seas.
Historians' subsequent estimates of the total death toll from the Wilhelm Gustloff sinking have generally ranged from approximately 5,000 to over 9,000 individuals, with many contemporary historians favoring estimates toward the higher end of this range, reflecting the genuine uncertainty inherent in calculating casualties for a vessel whose exact passenger count at the time of departure was never definitively established given the chaotic circumstances of its boarding process.
Even taking the more conservative estimates within this range, the Wilhelm Gustloff sinking represents a maritime disaster considerably deadlier than the sinking of the RMS Titanic, which claimed approximately 1,500 lives, and the sinking of the RMS Lusitania, which claimed approximately 1,200 lives, combined. A genuinely staggering human toll that by any reasonable historical measure should represent one of the most significant maritime disasters in recorded history.
Despite this genuinely extraordinary human cost, the Wilhelm Gustloff sinking has remained, for the decades since it occurred, a considerably less widely known historical event compared to disasters of dramatically smaller scale, a historical obscurity that reflects several distinct overlapping factors that historians have identified as contributing to the disaster's relative absence from broader public historical memory in the decades following the war's end. Perhaps the most significant factor contributing to this historical obscurity involves the genuinely complicated, uncomfortable position the disaster occupies within the broader historical memory of the Second World War, a conflict initiated by German aggression and marked by German atrocities of a scale and severity that dominate, for entirely legitimate historical and moral reasons, the primary focus of post-war historical memory regarding German wartime suffering and loss.
In the immediate post-war decades, both within Germany itself and in the broader international community, there existed a genuine, understandable reluctance to focus significant public attention on German civilian suffering during the war, given the moral weight and primary historical significance rightly assigned to the suffering Germany's own aggression and atrocities had inflicted on millions of victims across occupied Europe, and, in the case of the Holocaust, upon Europe's Jewish population specifically.
This broader historical reluctance to center German civilian wartime suffering within mainstream historical memory, while reflecting entirely legitimate and important moral and historical priorities regarding how the war's history should primarily be remembered and taught, nonetheless contributed to genuine historical events like the Wilhelm Gustloff sinking receiving considerably less sustained public attention and historical documentation than their sheer scale of human loss might otherwise warrant, a genuinely difficult tension that historians examining the broader question of how to appropriately incorporate German civilian wartime suffering into the broader historical narrative of the war have continued to grapple with in the decades since.
Additional factors contributing to the disaster's relative historical obscurity include the specific Cold War political context in which the disaster occurred and was initially processed, with the sinking having been carried out by Soviet naval forces at a moment when the Soviet Union was, of course, functioning as a critical Allied partner in the broader war against Nazi Germany, creating a genuinely awkward political dynamic in which drawing extensive public attention to a disaster caused by Soviet military action against the German vessel, however overwhelmingly civilian in its actual passenger composition, risked complicating the broader post-war narrative of Allied wartime cooperation and shared moral purpose in defeating Nazi Germany, a political sensitivity that persisted and, in various ways, intensified during the subsequent decades of Cold War tension between the Soviet Union and Western nations. The Soviet Union itself, for its own part, generally did not prioritize extensive public commemoration or historical documentation of the Wilhelm Gustloff sinking during the post-war decades, reflecting both the genuine complexity of publicly celebrating a military action that had resulted in such an overwhelming civilian death toll, and the broader Soviet historical narrative's general tendency to emphasize Soviet military achievements and sacrifices during the war, rather than devoting significant attention to actions whose primary practical effect had been the deaths of thousands of German civilians, rather than any particularly significant military or strategic outcome, given that the Wilhelm Gustloff, despite its wartime service supporting German naval training and evacuation efforts, was not at the time of its sinking functioning as an active military combat vessel in any meaningful operational sense.
Alexander Marinesko, the Soviet submarine commander responsible for the attack, experienced a genuinely complicated post-war career and historical legacy within the Soviet Union itself, initially receiving relatively limited official recognition for the attack despite its scale, reflecting both his own prior disciplinary difficulties within Soviet Naval Command and the broader Soviet ambivalence regarding how to publicly characterize and commemorate an action that, whatever its formal military justification, had resulted in such an overwhelming civilian death toll.
It was not until decades later, in 1990, in the final years of the Soviet Union's existence, that Marinesko was posthumously awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union, the country's highest military honor, a recognition that arrived only after a prolonged, complicated process of Soviet officials gradually reassessing how to publicly characterize his wartime actions. In the decades since the Cold War's end and the broader historical reassessment of Eastern Front and Baltic wartime history that has followed the opening of previously restricted archives and the general loosening of the political sensitivities that had constrained earlier historical discussion of the disaster, the Wilhelm Gustloff sinking has gradually received increasing historical attention and public documentation, including significant scholarly works and popular historical accounts that have worked to bring this genuinely extraordinary maritime disaster to a considerably wider public audience than it had previously received, though it nonetheless remains, even today, a considerably less widely known historical event compared to maritime disasters of dramatically smaller actual human cost. The story of the Wilhelm Gustloff stands as a genuinely sobering reminder of how the scale and prominence of historical memory does not always correspond directly to the actual scale of human loss and suffering a given historical event represents, reflecting instead the complex, often uncomfortable interplay of political context, national historical narratives, and the genuine moral complexity involved in appropriately remembering and contextualizing civilian suffering that occurred within the broader context of a war initiated by profound, systematic aggression and atrocity on the part of the nation whose civilians ultimately became, in this particular instance, the victims of one of history's deadliest single maritime disasters. This has been Forgotten Frontlines. Every story we bring you is researched, written, and brought to life by the V Team, because some battles deserve to be remembered, no matter how strange, no matter how forgotten. If this story moved you, like this video, share it with someone who loves history, and subscribe for more forgotten stories from the front lines of the past. We'll see you in the next one.